37,000 soldiers, an empty treasury, a kingdom smaller than modern Greece. Against them stood the largest empire the world had ever seen, 5.5 million square kilometers, stretching from the Balkans to India. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from dozens of subject peoples. The accumulated gold of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. Wealth beyond calculation. For 200 years, the Achaemenid Empire had dominated the known world. They had crushed Greek rebellions, burned Athens, and turned back every invasion. They could raise army after army. Alexander had one chance. One defeat, and his campaign would end in annihilation, 2,000 kilometers from home. When Alexander III of Macedon crossed into Asia in the spring of 334 BCE, the rational assessment was simple. He was marching to his death. This is the story of how a war that should have been impossible became the most complete military victory in ancient history. And why, when you look beneath the surface, it was never as impossible as it seemed. To understand why Alexander's victory seemed impossible, you have to understand what he was facing. The Persian Empire controlled everything that mattered in the ancient world. Egypt's grain, Mesopotamia's cities, the trade routes connecting east and west. Their royal road system could move messengers from Susa to Sardis over 2,500 kilometers in 9 days. They had governed this vast territory for 2 centuries through a sophisticated system of provincial governors called satraps, each commanding their own armies and treasuries. Their financial resources were functionally unlimited. The treasury at Persepolis alone held wealth accumulated over generations of tribute from subject peoples across 3 continents. With that gold, they could hire the best Greek mercenary hoplites, soldiers who knew exactly how Macedonians fought and how to counter them. They could bribe Greek city-states to rebel behind Alexander's back. They could sustain a war of attrition for decades. Their navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Phoenician and Egyptian squadrons could cut Alexander's supply lines, raid the Greek coast, and make any retreat impossible. And what did Alexander have? Macedonia was a kingdom of perhaps 500,000 people. His invasion force numbered between 37,000 and 47,000 men, impressive by Greek standards, trivial compared to what Persia could mobilize. His father, Philip II, had left him debts, not treasure. The campaign was funded on credit and the promise of plunder. If early victories didn't produce gold quickly, he couldn't pay his army. Worse, Alexander had no reserves. Every soldier lost was irreplaceable. One catastrophic defeat, one battle where the Macedonian army was destroyed, and the war was over. There would be no second chance. On paper, this was a mismatch of absurd proportions. But wars aren't fought on paper. They're fought with systems. And one side had spent a generation revolutionizing theirs. The army Alexander led into Asia was his father's creation. Philip II had transformed Macedonia from a backward kingdom into a military superpower through innovations that wouldn't be fully understood for centuries. Traditional Greek warfare was straightforward. 2 phalanxes of heavily armored hoplites would crash into each other, and whoever pushed harder won. Cavalry was secondary. Tactics were minimal. The side with more men and better stamina usually prevailed. Philip threw out that playbook entirely. He built the first true combined arms force in Western history, an army where different unit types were designed to work together as an integrated system, each component making the others more effective. The foundation was heavy infantry, organized into phalanx formations. But Philip's infantry carried a different weapon, the sarissa, a pike between 5 and 7 meters long. A traditional Greek spear was 2 to 3 meters. This difference was decisive. When a Macedonian phalanx faced an enemy, 5 ranks of pike points extended beyond the front line simultaneously. Anyone trying to attack them had to pass through a wall of iron before they could even reach the first soldier. No cavalry charge could break it. No infantry formation could push through it. But the phalanx wasn't designed to win battles by itself. Its job was to fix the enemy in place, to be the anvil. The hammer was the Companion Cavalry, heavy shock cavalry armed with long lances, trained to charge in wedge formation and punch through enemy lines at the point of maximum weakness. Once the phalanx pinned the enemy, the cavalry delivered the killing blow. Supporting these two arms were specialized units, elite Hippaspist infantry who protected the vulnerable flanks of the phalanx, Agrianian javelin troops who screened against enemy skirmishers, Thessalian cavalry who anchored the defensive wing. Every piece had a role. Every role supported the others. But the true revolution wasn't visible on the battlefield. It was in how the army moved. Ancient armies were slow. They depended on ox-drawn carts to carry supplies, which meant they crawled across the landscape at perhaps 15 kilometers a day. They needed established roads. They needed supply depots. They brought vast trains of non-combatants, servants, merchants, families. All of these people needed to be fed, which meant even more supplies, which meant more carts, which meant slower movement. Philip and Alexander stripped all of that away. They eliminated ox carts almost entirely. Soldiers carried their own equipment, about 30 pounds per man. Pack horses and mules replaced wagons. Non-combatant personnel were ruthlessly minimized. The result was an army that could march 30 kilometers in a day, twice the speed of a conventional force. They could cross terrain that would starve a Persian army. Deserts, mountains, regions without roads or supply depots. They could appear where the enemy didn't expect them, fight before the enemy was ready, and withdraw before the enemy could concentrate against them. This wasn't just about speed, it was about control. The side that moves faster chooses when and where battles happen. Alexander would spend the next decade fighting on ground he selected, at times he determined, against enemies who were never quite prepared. That advantage came from logistics, not genius.
The Persians weren't fools. They had capable commanders who understood exactly what they were facing. One of them proposed a strategy that might have won the war before it started. Memnon of Rhodes was a Greek mercenary who had served Persia for years. He had married into Persian nobility, commanded Persian forces, and fought against Macedonian armies before. He understood Alexander's strengths and his critical weakness. Alexander had no money. His army survived on plunder and local supplies. The further he advanced into Asia, the longer his supply lines stretched, the more dependent he became on capturing enemy resources. If those resources weren't there, his campaign would collapse. At a council of war at Zelea, before Alexander even crossed into Asia, Memnon proposed a devastating counter-strategy. Avoid battle entirely. Retreat before Alexander's advance. Burn the crops, empty the cities, destroy everything of value. Deny the Macedonians food, fodder, and plunder. Meanwhile, use the Persian fleet to attack Greece itself, stir up rebellions, cut Alexander's communications, force him to turn back, or starve. It was brutal, it was ruthless, and it would probably have worked. Alexander's empty treasury couldn't survive a long campaign without captured wealth. His single army couldn't survive attrition without the ability to replace losses. A year of chasing shadows through scorched earth while Greece burned behind him would have ended the invasion. The satraps rejected it. Arsaces, the satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, spoke for them. He would not allow a single house in his territory to be burned. The other provincial governors agreed. They were not going to destroy their own lands, impoverish their own provinces, sacrifice their own wealth for a defensive strategy when they had more than enough soldiers to simply crush this impudent invader in open battle. This was the structural flaw that would doom the empire. The Persian system distributed power to provincial governors who thought like provincial governors. They protected their own territories, their own interests, their own positions. The idea of sacrificing everything they had built for a grand strategic vision that might take years to succeed was simply unacceptable. And so they chose to give Alexander exactly what he wanted, a pitched battle where his superior doctrine could be decisive.
The first battle came at the Granicus River in May of 334 BCE. The Persian commanders had assembled perhaps 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, including a substantial force of Greek mercenary hoplites, the one unit capable of matching the Macedonian phalanx. They made a critical error. They positioned their cavalry right at the water's edge on steep, muddy banks where horses couldn't build momentum for a charge. The Greek mercenaries were held in reserve behind them, unable to engage. The Persians had chosen terrain that neutralized their cavalry's advantage while keeping their best infantry out of the fight. Alexander attacked immediately. A feint on the left drew Persian attention. Then he personally led the Companion Cavalry across the river on the right, scrambling up the muddy bank into the teeth of the Persian line. In the close-quarters melee that followed, he was nearly killed, struck on the helmet by a Persian axe, saved only when one of his officers severed the attacker's arm. But the companions broke through. The Persian cavalry collapsed. The satraps who had rejected Memnon's strategy died in the fighting, one after another. Then Alexander turned on the Greek mercenaries. Surrounded, they offered to surrender. He refused. These Greeks had chosen to fight for Persia against their own people. 2,000 were enslaved, the rest were slaughtered. The message was clear. Any Greek who took Persian gold was a traitor who would receive no mercy. 18 months later, the pattern repeated at Issus. This time, Darius III himself took the field with an army of perhaps 100,000. Through a remarkable feat of maneuvering, he actually got behind Alexander, cutting the Macedonian supply line. It should have been a decisive advantage, but Darius had positioned his army in a coastal plain barely 2.5 kilometers wide, hemmed in by mountains and sea. His massive numerical superiority was meaningless. He couldn't deploy his troops. The battle compressed into a narrow front where quality mattered more than quantity, and Darius made the error that would define his reign. He positioned himself at the center of his line. When Alexander's cavalry smashed through the Persian left and wheeled toward the center, Darius faced a choice: stand and fight, or flee and survive. He fled. His army, seeing the King of Kings running from the field, collapsed into chaos. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and children. He captured the Persian war treasury. He captured the certainty that Darius would run when directly threatened. 2 battles, 2 victories. But Alexander understood the war wasn't over. The Persian fleet still controlled the sea. As long as enemy ships could operate in the Mediterranean, his communications with Greece remained vulnerable and rebellion remained possible. His solution was elegant. He would defeat the Persian navy without fighting a single naval battle. He would simply capture every port. Most Phoenician cities surrendered without resistance. Tyre refused. The city sat on an island half a mile offshore, protected by walls 45 meters high. They had withstood sieges before. They believed themselves impregnable. Alexander's response was to build a causeway. His engineers began constructing a mole from the mainland toward the island, using rubble, timber, and debris from the old city on shore. The Tyrians attacked with fire ships, destroying the initial construction. Alexander ordered it rebuilt wider, beyond the range of shore bombardment. He assembled a fleet from surrendered Phoenician cities in Cyprus, blockading Tyre from the sea. For 7 months, the siege continued. Ship-mounted battering rams pounded the walls. The tallest siege towers in ancient history rose above the fortifications. When a breach finally opened in the southern wall, Alexander led the assault personally. The Tyrians paid for their resistance. 8,000 died in the fighting. 2,000 were crucified along the shore.
30,000 were sold into slavery. The message again was unmistakable. Gaza fell next after another brutal siege. Alexander took an arrow through his shield and armor into his shoulder. He continued fighting regardless. 2 months later, the city fell and the coastal strategy was complete. The Persian fleet, with nowhere left to operate, ceased to be a factor in the war. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. He was crowned pharaoh at Memphis. The Mediterranean was secure. Now there was nothing between him and Darius except the heartland of Persia itself.
Darius had learned from Isis. This time he chose the ground, a wide plain near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River. He had the terrain flattened to optimize conditions for his scythed chariots. He assembled the largest army he had ever commanded, between 90,000 and 250,000 men, according to various modern estimates. His line stretched beyond Alexander's flanks by more than a mile on each side. He had also prepared special weapons. 200 scythed chariots would shatter the Macedonian phalanx. 15 war elephants would terrify the enemy cavalry. This time, numbers and preparation would tell. Alexander had approximately 47,000 men. He was outnumbered by at least 2 to 1, possibly far more. Outflanked on both wings, deep in enemy territory with no possibility of retreat. The night before the battle, Darius kept his entire army standing to arms, fearing a night attack. They were exhausted at dawn. Alexander's men had slept soundly. When the battle began, Darius unleashed his chariots. They thundered toward the Macedonian line, scythes spinning on their axles. The Macedonians had been briefed. Agrianian javelin troops and archers shot down the horses and drivers at range. The chariots that made it through found the phalanx ranks opening before them, creating empty lanes. The chariots passed through harmlessly. Troops in the rear finished off the survivors. Darius's secret weapon had lasted less than an hour. Then Alexander began moving his cavalry to the right, edging toward the boundary of the prepared ground. Bessus, commanding the Persian left wing, sent his Bactrian and Scythian cavalry to match the movement, prevent Alexander from getting around his flank. He committed his reserves. He extended his line, and a gap opened between the Persian left and center. Alexander saw it. In a single, fluid motion, he halted the lateral movement, formed his companions and hypaspists into a wedge formation, wheeled 90 degrees, and charged directly into the gap, directly toward Darius. For the third time, Darius watched Alexander's cavalry thundering toward him. For the third time, he had to choose: stand and die, or flee and lose everything. He fled. The Persian center disintegrated behind him. The empire that had ruled for 200 years collapsed in a single afternoon. What followed was conquest on an unprecedented scale. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered its treasury, enough gold to pay off every debt and fund years of campaigning. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, was taken and burned. Whether that fire was deliberate policy or drunken accident, it meant the same thing. The Achaemenid dynasty was finished forever. But the war wasn't over. Darius was murdered by his own generals, and Alexander spent 7 more years fighting across Central Asia and into India. Different kinds of warfare, counterinsurgency against guerrilla resistance, grinding campaigns through mountains and deserts, enemies who wouldn't stand and fight. The impossible war took its toll. At Granicus, Alexander had been struck on the head, saved only by his officer's sword. At Gaza, an arrow pierced his shoulder through shield and armor. In Sogdiana, he broke a leg bone. At the Malayan city in India, an arrow punctured his lung. He nearly died on the operating table. By the time he returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, his body was a map of scars. He died there, aged 32, likely from a combination of accumulated wounds, exhaustion, and illness.
The war that should have been impossible had consumed him.
We must maintain order.
So was it really impossible? By the numbers, absolutely. A small kingdom against a continental empire, with no financial reserves and no margin for error. The rational assessment was that Alexander was doomed. But wars aren't won by numbers alone. They're won by systems. And when you examine the systems, the outcome looks very different. First, doctrinal superiority. The Macedonian combined arms approach, phalanx as anvil, shock cavalry as hammer, integrated supporting units, created tactical problems the Persians simply couldn't solve. They had no answer to the Sarissa wall. They had no counter to the companion charge. Every time they fought a pitched battle, they fought at a disadvantage no amount of numbers could overcome. Second, the logistics revolution. Speed and sustainability that Persian commanders couldn't match or anticipate. Alexander always controlled when and where battles happened because he could move twice as fast and survive in terrain that would starve a conventional army. Strategic initiative was his from the first day to the last. Third, structural weakness on the Persian side. The empire was decentralized by design. Satraps protected their own interests. When Memnon proposed the one strategy that might have worked, scorched earth and naval counteroffensive, they rejected it because it required sacrificing their personal domains for imperial survival. They couldn't make that choice. The system wouldn't let them. Alexander didn't defeat the Persian Empire through genius alone. He exploited structural flaws in his enemy while preventing them from exploiting his own vulnerabilities. He fought the war his system was designed to win, and he prevented the Persians from fighting the war their resources should have allowed them to win. The impossible war was, in hindsight, almost inevitable, not because Alexander was superhuman, but because he understood something that remains true today. Wars are won by systems, not just soldiers. And his system was better. When Alexander died in Babylon, his body bore the scars of a decade of war that should never have been survivable. The impossible war had consumed him. But what he proved still echoes through military history, that a smaller force, better organized, better led, and better sustained, can bring down giants. It's a lesson worth remembering.